Hey there, Knicks fans. How you doing? It's your boy, Jonathan Macri, with you for a very special edition of the Knicks Film School Podcast. I am going to be so bold when I introduce this person, bolder than usual, because he's doing what he does, what he's been doing for decades, covering this league as well as anyone for the Ringer, which is a site we all know and love around here. But his voice has not graced the Low Post podcast recently because there is some more Low Post podcast. So I feel there's extra weight on my shoulders as I say the famous words. What up, Beck? How you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks for the nice intro. Good to be back. I missed the Low Post as much as anybody else and miss hearing Zach say it. I have seen him a couple times in the last few months, just run into him at various events. Chit chat a little bit here and there. I can confidently report Zach is doing well. He's fine. No, I don't know when or where we will see him doing what he does best again. But like everyone else, I hope it's soon. So,
well, Howard, we got you on the pod today. That's not too shabby.
That's okay. I'm no Zach.
Listen,
but, you know.
Yeah, listen. You guys are the yin to each other's yang. There's a reason why. Like, I don't know if you saw that graphic somebody put together. Or it was like last year, like the tiers of like the Low Post podcast, and you were in the obviously the God tier. Like that's not an accident, my friend.
I did see that now that you remind me of it, and that was very nice also, and a little embarrassing, but thank you, whoever did that. That was kind.
So the Knicks. How about those Knicks? We're here to talk about them today, and it's a team that you know very well because you used to cover them on a somewhat closer basis a long time ago, but obviously you've covered the league for a long time, paid attention to their trials and tribulations, of which there have been many. Last several years have been pretty good, and then it led to this summer, and a bunch of stuff happened this summer, and season's been an interesting season on paper, a very good season, and yet if you talk to the average Knicks fan today, you will probably have to talk them out of jumping off a bridge or some other tall object. So I find it's an interesting place that we have you on the pod today. And I want to start with an article you actually wrote before the season started. And, you know, you've been critical of the team in years past at kind of going for the shiny object. And you list some of those shiny objects that they've gone off after through the years. And you were like, well, listen, you could make the argument that Karl-Anthony Towns is in that lineage, but it's not a good argument. And you proceeded to write why you thought that the trade was a smart trade. And it was one that has definitely a high ceiling and also fit where the team is at right now and where they're going. So I want to start there because I think with these recent losses and with the best teams in the NBA showing that, you know what, maybe Towns isn't as big of a problem on offense against us. And meanwhile, when he's on defense, well, we could take extra large advantage of him. Do you think it's too early to judge the Towns trade? Can we call it a success? Would you call it a failure? Is it still like TBD? Where are you at now, several months after you wrote that piece?
Yeah, I think it's still TBD. And I think one of the main messages I was trying to convey in that column was simply, this isn't like the other past reach for the shiny object, when the press conference type swing for the fences moves, because he was not coming in as the savior. They already had the savior. His name is Jalen Brunson, right? So in the past, most of the moves that I listed at one point in that story were, you know, we need Stephon Marbury to come save us. We need Amari Stoudemire to come save us. Carmelo Anthony to come save us. You know, the various degrees with all these things. Steve Francis, Zach Randolph. I'm sorry to torture people with all of these.
Steve Francis.
Oh boy. It was a time, the mid 2000s to the mid 2010s. But this wasn't that, because Karl-Anthony Towns wasn't being brought in to say, you're the guy. They have the guy. He's being brought in to be the co-star. And there were a lot of reasons to think he'd be a great fit with Brunson. And I think most of those have borne out, offensively at least. There was risk baked in. There was risk defensively baked in, especially with Mitchell Robinson on the shelf and Isaiah Hartenstein gone. There was risk baked in based on the fact that Karl-Anthony Towns has a history of missing a good chunk of every season due to injury. And you compound that by the fact that OG Anunoby, who they signed to a massive extension, misses a lot of every season due to injury historically, right? So there was a lot of risk baked into that. there was risk baked into acquiring Mikal Bridges for basically all their draft assets too. So they took some big swings last summer, but they were completion type swings. They were to complete the picture, complete the roster, not to say we're a terrible team and let's do something desperate to put ourselves on the map. Boom, let's go get Eddie Curry. Boom, let's go get, I don't need to keep torturing people with the past, but
you love it. It's a minute.
It's but the point of my view of the Towns trade is that it wasn't those things, because the context of your starting point is dramatically, fundamentally different. And I did have some concerns at the time. I didn't go into it in that piece just because that wasn't the theme of that day. It was more just the idea that there are risks baked in, but you don't know how those are going to play out until you actually get into the teeth of the season, right? And what you hope at the moment that you get Towns is, one, obviously you hope that Mitchell Robinson's going to come back sooner than later. He hasn't, but maybe we are days away, hours away, something.
We'll touch on that in a sec.
Yeah. But in the meantime, I kind of viewed it as they're trying to do a version of, this is very imperfect analogy, but bear with me, a version of, well, if the Denver Nuggets, bear with me, can win with a non-defensive presence type center, right? Now, Jokic is at a whole other level than Towns, but you've got an offensive anchor at center who's not a classic rim protector, who's not a classic paint protector, but we're going to get it done in the year that they did get it done because we have Kentavious Caldwell-Pope, and we've got Aaron Gordon, we've got other guys to be the lockdown defenders on the perimeter. Can you build a defense essentially from the outside in? And I wondered, could the Knicks do some version of that? You've got OG Anunoby, you've got Mikal Bridges, you've got Josh Hart. Can you be stout enough on the perimeter, stingy enough, cover enough ground that maybe it won't matter that you've got a guy who is average to often below average at center in Towns defensively? It clearly has not worked out that way, because they're bottom third in defense right now, I believe, still.
The 20th, and I was looking on Cleaning the Glass, their half-court defensive number, brace yourself, is 27th as of right now. Yeah. It's not where you want it to be.
And last year they were 9th in defensive efficiency. And it's not because they acquired Towns specifically. It is because of all of the moves together. And one of the other things I did say somewhere, my podcast, the real ones at the Ringer, or somewhere back in the fall, I did say at the time that I'm losing my train of thought on this one.
At the time of the Towns trade,
yes, at the time that the biggest thing that happened over the summer for the Knicks, arguably, was not that they went out and spent all this capital to get Towns and Bridges. It was that they lost Isaiah Hartenstein. And I feel like it got lost amid the shuffle of everything. And that was not one, they didn't choose to lose Isaiah Hartenstein. They were a victim of CBA rules, of cap rules. And it happens sometimes. They're not the only ones. This happens in the league. They offered him as much as they could. He did the thing that players usually do, which is took more money and went to another team. But the character, and we'll get into this a little bit as we contrast last year with this year, but the character of last season's team, it was so much just about kind of the grittiness of that team, right? Bodies are going down. You just plug in a new guy. They had depth that they don't have now. And they had, the 1-2 punch of Hartenstein and Mitchell Robinson at center. And so far this season, you have neither. That's a huge difference on its own. So while we can sit here and hand-wring about the Towns trade and what Towns is and what he isn't, and what that has done to them defensively, it's also a lot about who they lost and who hasn't played yet in terms of Robinson. And so I just think that, so much of if we're going to talk about last season, it's just this season of good vibes. They were fun, they were gritty, they busted their asses. Hartenstein was a big part of that, and so was DiVincenzo, and they're both gone. So I think those losses, and I always think about the NBA through these ripple effects of these small, sometimes smaller moves, but just chemistry. You pull one little thread, and sometimes the whole picture changes. And I think that, again, yes, the additions are important as we evaluate who the Knicks are today, but the losses are equally important.
I'm so happy you went there and hopping around a little bit, because that reminds me of another article that you wrote, which was last May. You called the Knicks season a year ago a fever dream, and having lived through it, and I could tell you, I have a lot of readers to the Knicks Film School newsletter who were around for the championship years. And I shit you not, there were people who would comment to me and write to me and say, I remember those teams. This is my favorite Knicks team ever, which sounds insane. But the way that team went out there and gave it everything that they had and left it all on the floor. And Hartenstein, like, look, no one's going to say that Isaiah Hartenstein is a better player than Karl-Anthony Towns, but he was so integral to what they did on that team last year. And you've been covering the league for a long time. Is it an overreaction to say, like, yeah, just you may lose a guy? Is Hartenstein a top 100 NBA player, top 80 NBA player? I don't know. He's good, but he's not like in the elite. Like, I know you've seen this before where just something changes and you wouldn't think it was going to have as big of an impact, but it just changes it so much.
Yeah. And he's that kind of player, right? So we think about players in various categories, right? Like the guys who have like the broadest skill set, those become the superstars, right? And then there's a cut below them that are just like the just everyday stars who are not quite superstars. And Hartenstein is like your classic, like high level role player, right?
Yeah.
He'll probably never be all NBA. He'll probably never make an all defensive team. He may never win a single award of note, but he's a winning player. Yeah. And we saw that last season in crystal clear. And we're seeing it again in his role with the Thunder. Sometimes those guys are more important than the guys who have the flashy skill set and the max contract and all the other stuff on their resume. And it's just as you just said it. Like, yeah, he's not better than Karl-Anthony Towns, but in some ways he's more important to the success of a team, or can be. And by the way, in a universe where, and here we go into a bunch of sliding doors moments here, in a universe where they could have kept Hartenstein. First thing is, I don't know if they actually make the Towns trade or not. I'm not positive on this one. But in a world where they could have kept Hartenstein, and maybe they still make the Towns trade, and those two are your 4 or 5 together. It's not quite the same as having Rudy Gobert next to him. I mean, Rudy Gobert's a multiple time defensive player of the year and all defensive and all everything. But the reason the Timberwolves were able to have the breakthrough season that they had last season was that they finally had somebody to do the things that Towns could not. And I think there's some formula there. If you have decided to tie your fate to Karl-Anthony Towns, as the Wolves had, as the Knicks now are, you have to solve that problem. Yep. And the Timberwolves solve was, we're going to trade all of our draft assets in a deal that was much, much criticized to get Rudy Gobert. And it resulted in their best season in, decades. And they've slipped since for a variety of reasons. We don't need to talk about the Timberwolves' woes on this podcast. But this is the challenge the Knicks front office has created for itself. Okay, we've got Towns. We've got our 1-2 punch. We've got a fantastic starting 5. We've got a group that we think we can roll with for the next, 3, 4, 5 years. But the combination of Brunson, who's a net minus on defense, and Towns, who is, as of right now, so I was looking at on Dunks and Threes estimated plus minus EPM, which is by most estimates or assessments the gold standard of public analytics. Towns is a plus 0.2 in defensive EPM, so he's just slightly above average, and Brunson's a minus 1.5, which is not good. But those guys are critical to your success because of what they do offensively, right? So you have to have them out there. It's like like Nash and Stoudemire back in the day with the Suns or something, right? Where we can't win without these guys, but we know that they're going to give up a lot at the other end. How do we try to patch that up and live with it? And that's the challenge the Knicks are facing.
And I'm glad, I'm happy you used the phrasing that you did. Nobody hoisted this on them. You could make an argument that the Towns trade, in terms of what they gave up, and you're talking to the biggest DiVincenzo fan in the world. I love DiVincenzo. Randall, we kind of know what Randall is. The pick will convey. The pick is be a middle first round pick, but you could say, yeah, the price was too reasonable for them. They had to make it, but they made it with open eyes, and they made it with all the evidence that we've all seen, because Karl-Anthony Towns is not a first or second year player. He's been in the league for 9 years
and played for Tibbs before.
And he played for Tibbs before, exactly. And so, which is what makes even more interesting, so when we talked about this a little bit before we started recording, Tom Thibodeau had some comments to the press today, insinuating that, the quote got spread around with a little bit out of context because he mentioned that Mitchell Robinson was projected to be their starting center. But the quote that made it around is Tibbs saying, we've been without our starting center for 50 some odd games. At the very least, I think it's fair to assume that internally, or at least within the coaching staff, there is some thought to, hey, maybe Towns is not going to be our 5 moving forward. And then you pair that with something, and again, I'm going to reference your article, and if anybody hasn't read these, just go on ringer.com, look up Howard's name. And actually, Andrew, we could link these to this interview. So yeah, just go right down below and click on them if you haven't read them, because they're as relevant today as they were when Howard wrote them. But the preseason article about the Towns trade, you quoted Josh Hart as saying, I'm not going to sit here and label us contenders. And I read it at the time when you wrote it, and I was like, yeah, that's just something that like players say because they don't want to put the expectations on themselves. Like, maybe that's what it was. That's what it was. But I almost wonder, especially in light of the other thing you just said, which is that this is like a 3-4, maybe if they're lucky, 5-year window. I'm wondering if they kind of went into this with more open eyes than we're realizing right now, coming off of these disastrous losses to Cleveland and Boston, where they're maybe internally thinking like, look, this is the best version of the team that we could put together for this year, but we are going to have more transaction cycles. And even though it doesn't look like we have many picks right now, there's going to be other stuff that we're going to be able to do. So if it's not Mitch, maybe we get a different center in this next summer or the next trade deadline or something like that. Do you give any credence to any of that? Or do you think this is just a Knicks fan trying to talk himself into something?
They knew that Mitchell Robinson was going to be out for a while to start the season. So I don't think there's any ambiguity there. Like if Tibbs says, we knew we were going to be missing our projected starting center, or however he phrased it. It is interesting in the sense that from the moment they made the Towns trade, the question I think everybody was all asking each other was, interesting. Is he going to be the starting 5 and Mitchell Robinson comes off the bench behind him? Are they going to start together? Is how functional will that be, or whatever? Mitchell Robinson's always going to miss time. Towns could miss time. What happens when you only have one? Like, we wondered about all these different things, right? How does the front court rotation look if everybody's healthy? And again, presumably we're going to see that soon. But we don't have that answer yet. And I think the one thing that's concerning to me on behalf of the Knicks would be, you can't sit here on February 25th as we're recording this, look at your defensive rating of 20th and half court rating of what was it, 27th?
27th, according to Cleaning the Glass, yeah.
And assume that a Mitchell Robinson who has missed most of the season and who every year does get banged up is going to come in and solve all your defensive issues right off the bat. Like, that's just not a reasonable expectation, right?
I hope not. I hope that's not what they're thinking.
But it's also the only thing that they can look to, right?
Right now, yeah.
What else can you say other than, well, we'll play harder or we'll play smarter?
Yeah.
There's nothing else you can do to change the alignment and the rotation. We're past the trade deadline. They have very little room to work with as it was in terms of cap room, or room under the second apron, I should say. And so this is where you are. You're hoping that Mitchell Robinson, and not just his presence, but maybe the domino effect of like, well, a little bit more him means a little bit less Precious Achiuwa, or a little less of this, or different combinations. And hopefully somewhere in all of that, you get better 48 minutes of defense. But it's a lot to place on one guy who's always hurt and who is also not Rudy Gobert. Like, Mitchell Robinson's really good, but like, let's not get crazy. This is not Dikembe Mutombo coming in. So I'll be curious to see how that unfolds. To the question of whether or not they thought they'd be contenders immediately, like, I think there was a vague hope there. Like, okay, we're a 50+ win team. We just traded for a guy who's got all NBA talent in Karl-Anthony Towns. We traded for a guy who's a great, two-way player in Mikal Bridges. We've expended everything we've got in terms of assets. So I think it's fair for us on the outside to interpret that they thought this was a finished product, in that they've now spent everything they've got to create this particular group. But you always knew it was going to be like, well, if a couple things break your way, then you can beat the Celtics. I don't think anybody also thought, like the Cavaliers were suddenly going to be on like a 68 win pace or whatever they're on now. And now there's two big obstacles in the East. Flip side of that, of course, is like there was a reasonable thought that the Sixers. I know it sounds like a joke to say it now. The Sixers and or the Bucks.
We could laugh about the Sixers.
It's fine. Our producer on the Real Ones pod, Cliff, is a Philly guy, and so we just spent like a half hour torturing him about the Sixers. It was ugly, but yay tanking. Keep your pick, Philly. It's rough, man. It's rough
a little bit.
But that's I don't know where I don't know where I was going.
Cleveland's really good, and Boston, and I would like, Bill Simmons over at the Ringer has been talking. He talked up Cleveland recently as a legit title contender, even before they came in and smoked the Knicks on Friday night. And like, I don't know that we should have had any doubts about them before that game, but certainly not anymore. And yet I'm going against my instinct when I say, I even think Boston is a different animal, because if you look at Cleveland on paper, like there are ways, in theory, maybe they've overcome those ways, that you could attack, a lineup with the two traditional bigs, even though Mobley's kind of spacing it a little bit more, and two smaller guards. Boston, like, it's like, do you just wait it out? Because when they're on, it's like they've assembled a perfect basketball team. And I think that, if I had like a list of questions to ask Leon Rose, which I'll prepare obviously for the next time he gives a press conference, one of them would be like, I have to give truth serum for this. Like, was part of the plan, like, listen, eventually Boston's just going to age out or expend themselves out with the ownership situation, and who knows with the second apron and all that stuff. Like, one of those two things. And I don't know. We don't know. We're sitting here right now.
I think, it sounds glib and stupid, ridiculous to say this, but I think there is some version of this where like the best hope for the whole league is that when the Celtics get sold, the new owners are not nearly as willing to pay massive luxury taxes, and they start to break up that core. Like the way the system is built now, it is really, really hard to keep a team together with the kind of talent that the Celtics have, right? Two superstars on max deals, plus a bunch of other really, really good players whose market value is high enough that in the aggregate, you are blowing straight past the second apron. And if there were a third, fourth, and fifth apron, you might hit those two. And there are consequences beyond financial to be past the second apron, right? You start losing tools to add to your roster or fix things when things break. So the Celtics' new ownership might have a different view of this. They might break this up on some level. And break it up was not going to be like, they're trading Jalen Brown. It may just mean like you lose a Drew Holiday or a Derek White or whoever. But no, I don't think when you're dealing with like an aging, some aging dynasty, whatever, like the latter years of the Warriors dynasty. If you were somebody else in the West and you were a young building team, like say, let's use the Grizzlies as an example. I do think a front office looks at a team like the Warriors or however many teams were at the top there, and you're going, okay, that team's got a bunch of guys in their 30s. They're going to age out. Let's build this so that we are starting to peak when that team is falling off the cliff, right? Like, I think that that's a reasonable way to plan in the NBA. If you're not in contention and you're building toward it, you do look at time horizons that sometimes coincide with when the reigning superpowers are going to fall off due to age and whatever else. This is not one of those cases, though, because Tatum and Brown are like straight in their primes.
Yeah.
They don't have anybody aside from Al Horford who's really about to age out. And I just think you've got to meet them head on. So this is what I respect about what the Knicks decided to do. Like, they could have kept their powder dry, not sent out the picks for Bridges or not made the Towns trade, and done the thing that they had been doing, right? Like, I wrote a whole other, a really long piece last spring about the Knicks and about how they built themselves back to respectability. And a lot of it was about the patience that they had exhibited that prior administrations for 20 years had not. But a lot of that was saving up those picks to basically, you're going to eventually go make that run at Giannis if he decides he wants out, or whoever it was going to be. Well, none of those guys ever became available in the window that the Knicks had been stockpiling picks.
Yeah.
And so they went out and used them differently. They didn't use them on a superstar. They didn't use them on the big blockbuster. Like Towns is blockbuster-ish, but not at that level. And I understood it because there was a moment right now. Jalen Brunson's in his prime. You've just finished a 50-something win season. You got a bunch of really good players. Are there some finishing touches you could put on it that put you at least in a position where you might be able to challenge the Celtics? That's what they did. I respect it because it was a vote of confidence in what they already had built, and also their hunches about what these new guys would do for that. if you want to look at it right now and say 0-5 against the 2 top teams in the East or 0-7 against the 3 best teams in the NBA, so ergo, therefore, it's a bust, and you can, but it's February 25th. We're still 2 months away from the playoffs, or 7 weeks, something like that. Let's see where things are then. I'm not ready to throw, or I'm not ready to bury them over those deals.
And it's year one.
And it's my concern though, Jonathan, would be this: okay, Mitchell Robinson comes back. Let's say he stays healthy. He's probably not solving everything. The real concern becomes, and we're getting way too far ahead of ourselves, but in the offseason, you're so hemmed in now, right? You have spent basically all of your assets. There's very little to work with in terms of draft capital. You don't have a lot of players. You got a lot of good players, but who are you moving, right? Like, you're not trading the 2 tent poles, right? Nope. Brunson and Towns are probably here regardless. Anunoby would be really hard to move because he's got a huge contract and an injury history that would scare a lot of teams off. You're not moving Josh Hart, I don't think, because my God, he's like the heart and soul of the team. Like, I hate to use the pun, but how do you, you just can't. Bridges, maybe, but nothing else. Like, you're not Deuce McBriding your way to some big trade, right? You're not. There's nothing else to move to move the ball forward. It would probably be Bridges by default, and who knows? Again, we're way ahead of ourselves. But
how would that play after you just gave up 5 first-round picks and a swap to get him?
Yeah, it's tough. It's tough. But again, we're too far ahead of ourselves, and let's see where this goes this spring first.
But I also don't think that projecting out and saying, okay, if as currently constituted, it just falls short. Like, even if, let's say, they go up against Boston and it's maybe closer than it appears it would be at this point in time, but it's clear that the Celtics are just a level up, then and again, I'm a Knicks fan who has enjoyed the heck out of the season. I've loved seeing this team be the offense that it is. I mean, we went quite literally years without ever seeing a 30 assist game, and they've had I don't know how many 30 assist games. The good has been really, really good and really, really fun. But there's also this other side of the coin, which is okay, well, is there a plan to at least give us a shot at that top rung? And I think that's what has fans kind of concerned right now. The one thing that is or does not have to be a concern, or isn't a concern, and you've mentioned his name a few times, is Jalen Brunson. I ran out of good stuff to say about Jalen Brunson a long time ago, and I am an old school believer that show me your best guy, I'll show you my best guy, and we'll go and dance. Again, maybe naively, I'm willing to put him up in the last 5 minutes of a close game against pretty much anyone else out there in the league. You've been watching the league for a very long time. What are your thoughts on Jalen and the ceiling of a team with him as their best player?
Yeah, I think I emptied out my entire bag of adjectives on him for a couple of those playoff game columns last spring too. He's awesome, and he's so much fun. He's so grounded. He's so humble. He's the least bragging, braggadocious, something, one of those words, stars that you could find in this league. There's nobody in the NBA who could possibly be rooting against that guy and who doesn't love watching him play. But it is hard, right? A lot of what he does takes a lot of work, right? And the concern I have, and had this last season too, especially as bodies were going down left and right, there's so much on him. And Towns alleviates some of that just from a pure production standpoint, right? Here's another guy who can get you 25, 30 on a given night. But Towns isn't creating it for the most part. The elite teams right now, look at the Celtics, right? It's Brown and Tatum, but also Derek White can do a lot with the ball in his hands, and Drew Holiday can still do some things with the ball in his hands. And the Cavs have the 1-2 punch with Mitchell and Garland, and then occasionally, Evan Mobley's offense is evolving. The Knicks just don't have anybody else who you can say, all right, Brunson's tired, or Brunson's on the bench, or it's not his night, or whatever. You can't hand the ball to anybody else and say, go. And that's, I think, the concern I have with just the general construction too, is Brunson's awesome. And, he what did he finish 5th in the MVP voting last year? I think he was 5th on my ballot.
Year,
yeah. I don't know if he's going to make it on MVP ballots again this year, because it's a little bit harder to parse out him versus Towns. It's funny, Basketball Reference, if you look at the MVP tracker, which is purely an algorithm, Jalen's not even showing up, but Towns is. He's like fourth or fifth or something in the probabilities, but like with a 1.2% probability. I just think that Brunson has so much on his shoulders. He carries so much weight and responsibility night in, night out for this team. And I think, if we're just dreaming, what's the ideal running mate for him? Maybe it's not Towns, or maybe in addition to Towns, you need like a big ball handling wing.
Yeah.
Good luck go finding it. Like, an easy for me to say. But it's you need one other guy who can do some things with the ball in his hands. I had thought at one point, because Bridges did a little bit of this in Phoenix and did a little bit of this when he was like kind of a de facto number one in Brooklyn, like that's not a role he's best suited for, but Bridges could run an offense. And I thought maybe, I always like use Iguodala as like the stand-in for this, but Iguodala would come off the bench for the Warriors during some of those years and be that playmaking forward off the bench and keep the offense humming while Curry was taking a breather. I thought the Knicks might use Bridges more in that role. It hasn't really, I don't think, come to pass.
It's funny, like we get snippets of it, like obviously the Christmas Day game against the Spurs, he was on fire, but just more in the course of regular business. Like they had a game against the Bulls, the first game out of the break, which was much closer than it should have been. But like Brunson and Towns are on the bench at the start of the fourth quarter, and Bridges scored the first 3 baskets and then had a nice assist to the corner. And like you'll see those stretches and they're encouraging, but it's also coming all off of mid-rangers, because he's not getting to the line and he's not like breaking guys down off the dribble. So he does not look the part of the type of guy that you are talking about.
No, he doesn't. I thought there was maybe a little bit more of that based on, again, some of the tail end of his Phoenix time and his Brooklyn time in Brooklyn. I don't know if that's by choice, by design, by Tibbs, or if that's just a recognition that maybe Bridges isn't terribly efficient if you go to that too much. I don't know. All I know is they need another guy. Like they need one other guy who you can put the ball in his hands. Sometimes when Brunson's on the court, just to alleviate some of the wear and tear or just the burden. And sometimes when he's on the bench because you need somebody else to keep the offense going. But everybody else has a 1-2 punch that involves a guy who can create. Again, Cat is part of a 1-2 punch. He's a big who does not create with the ball in his hands, and I think that's the difficulty here.
And it is a difficulty because, as you said, those guys are not only not easy to come by, but if one becomes available, you're probably going to have some other suitors. Let's before we get out of here, I do want to ask you about a name you just brought up, which is Tom Thibodeau. Tibbs is. I don't know if you may have forgotten this or if you knew it at all. I'm a big Tibbs fan. Big Tibbs guy, always been a big Tibbs guy, much to my detriment when it comes to a lot of Knicks Nation here. And he has come under fire recently with, some lineup decisions, putting out some like non-spacing lineups or not with ideal spacing. The minutes thing obviously is always around there. There is something about him though that I think like even more like every fan base when things are going bad is going to like blame the coach. There's something even a little extra with him with fans, and I always am intrigued by like what that is. I wonder if it's like purely reputation, if it's kind of how like the cut of his jib, how he comes off. Again, you've covered Tibbs for a while. Like what are your
great jib? By the way, he's got a tremendous jib. The cut.
He has one of my favorite jibs. It's a genuine jib. It is really genuine. So that's all you can ask for. Look, he's a great coach. But if you're looking at this objectively, are you thinking like he's like the Mark Jackson and there's got to be a Steve Kerr out there? Or do you think he is the guy that can maybe take New York all the way?
It's interesting. We have seen versions of this, right? Where, JB Bickerstaff got the Cavs to respectability, built up their defensive identity, and then Kenny Atkinson comes in, opens up the offense, and the Cavs jump to a new level. And then that same JB Bickerstaff goes to Detroit, replacing Monty Williams, where the Pistons have just been a disaster, and Bickerstaff has now made that. So, like the context of a coach and the roster and the development arc of that roster at that time, like there's so many different factors here. And sometimes you just need a new voice or a new approach or new ideas. And it might take a team from good to great or from great to contender. I don't know if we're in that position here with Tibbs or not. I do think, the minutes thing is a real concern, right? I know there's like these two absolutely polarizing camps that just want to kill each other about the minutes. People crying minutes police, and the other people crying like Tibbs is burning all his guys out. There's some nuanced middle ground there that I think where the truth lies, which is that he does play like the game the other day. 20-point game with 4 minutes to go or whatever. Like, there's no point in having your guys out there, and yet they're still out there. Tom Haberstroh at Yahoo recently had written something about the fact that the Knicks starters were playing more low leverage minutes than it, so they were playing a lot of garbage time where the game's already out of hand more than anybody else. Those, if you want to speak in the defense of Tibbs playing guys more than most coaches do in today's load management, sports science driven NBA, fine. There's a debate to be had about the relationship between fatigue and injury, about the relationship between playing big minutes and conditioning, and whether it actually prepares you for going deeper into the spring. You can have all those debates, and the sports scientists and the people with all the data will tell you there's a variety of ways to look at this, but I don't think there's any real way to explain away playing keeping your starters in when you're down 20 with 3 minutes to go. There's one
of which is Karl-Anthony Towns, who had just barely ambled off the court.
And look, he was in serious pain at that moment too.
Yeah.
That stuff I don't get. That stuff I don't think is not defensible. And Tibbs is a great coach, but there's some blind spots, and plenty of great coaches have blind spots, but he has one. We can acknowledge that. Yeah. Whether he's the guy who gets them to the championship, I don't think that whether it's this season or next or whatever, it's going to be dependent more on, and this is always the case in the NBA, almost always the case. It's more dependent on the personnel than it is the coach. We know that Tibbs is a great defensive coach, and yet they're 20th in defensive efficiency. We know he's a great defensive coach, and yet the 3 years he spent in Minnesota, they were bottom third of the league in defensive efficiency. Why? Because he didn't have the personnel. You need the personnel. No matter what your emphasis is, no matter what your philosophy is, no matter how great you are at said thing, you are beholden to the personnel you have. And so I don't think it's I don't think you sit here and say today, there's no way they're ever winning a championship with Tibbs. That's kind of ridiculous. I also wouldn't rule out the possibility that a different coach with a different philosophy might unlock something, because we've seen that happen in other cases. He's not infallible. But no, I'm not about to jump on the whatever. If there's a fire Tibbs bandwagon going on right now in some pocket of Knicks fandom, I'm not jumping on there.
You don't have to worry about that. There's no more room on that bandwagon. So not
he's
a guy to see it anyway.
He is a polarizing coach, whether it's the cut of his jib or his minutes distribution or whatever. He is, but undeniable. I think you may have had this conversation at one point. Undeniable that he has been absolutely one of the biggest factors in this reemergence, this renaissance of the last few years, but also that, and I will say this and admit it outright, I did not think he was the right hire at the time, because at the time that Leon Rose took over and hired Tibbs, I thought what the Knicks really needed was a strip down. They were somewhere in that murky middle to below. I can't remember exactly where they were, but they were not in a good place. No. And I thought their best agenda, or the way to go at that time, would be lean into the tank a little bit, or a rebuild, however you want to look at it. Hire more of a development coach, whether that's whatever Ime Udoka,
Atkinson was the name.
Kenny Atkinson
at the time,
or what we're seeing with Jordy Fernandez now in Brooklyn, that kind of coach, young coach who's going to just build guys up and whatever, play the lottery odds a little bit, bide your time. And I thought the one thing about Tibbs, which is obviously to his credit, is that he gets the absolute most out of a team always. And I thought that was I didn't think winning was the right idea for them at that time. I thought they were better off being bad for a little bit, which is something they almost never opt to do, or I don't think have in the 21 years I've been in New York. I thought that was the better way to go. Arguably, I was wrong, because not only did Tibbs mold them into a competitor at the expense of higher draft choices, for sure. But my God, look where they are. The results speak for themselves. No Knicks fan in their right mind, I think, would undo or give up what you guys had the last couple of years, and how enjoyable that's been for the version that I was proposing 5 years ago. So Tibbs deserves a lot of credit for that.
Yeah. And he's going to have his work cut out for him here because of all the things we just talked about, even though, as you said, this is still a much, 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 much better situation than this team and this franchise has been in for a very long time.
Yeah, and before you wrap, I just want to note this real quick because I was looking it up before the pod, and lest I waste a perfectly good stat that I had looked up.
Oh, please.
They're going to win 50 plus again, right? I think they're on pace for 53, 54. I'm sure you already know this. The last time they had back-to-back 50-win seasons?
Was it 93, 94, 92, 93?
It's just the next 93, 94, 94, 95.
94, 95, that's right. They just eked out. Yeah.
It's been a really, really long time since they've been this good in back-to-back years. Before last year, of course, it had been 11 years since the previous 50-win season. And before that, they had one 50-win season in a 23-year span, and now they're going to have back-to-back. So, there haven't even been that many 50-win seasons for the Knicks period since the mid-90s, much less back-to-back, which, again, first time since the mid-90s. That matters. That matters. They may not be able to get past Boston. They may not even be able to get past Cleveland. We'll see. But my God, I think perspective is really important right now, especially on the heels of a weekend in which, they got their butts kicked by two clear contenders. And I know it's deflating, and I know the 0-5 looks rough and all the rest of it. But I think the context of this matters too. And it's interesting. I think there's sometimes a divide between, and I'm just my own perception living in New York and obviously being on social media. I feel like younger fans, it's that's where more of the angst is. The older fans who maybe lived through all the lean years after the championships in the 70s or the lean times in the 80s, or having to deal with the early 2000s, whatever. There's been a lot to survive, to get through, a lot of just psychological angst. I think for the fans who look at it through that prism, I know you want it, obviously once you break through, you want it to be the next thing. But I think there's a lot of psychological effects here at work, where last year felt like a joyride, even with guys getting injured, because they just kept overachieving. They just kept going, and it was awesome to watch, and it was really impressive to watch. Whereas a different version of it this year and a similar level of success will not feel as satisfying. But again, that's why I put it in the historical context, because I think you would opt for this in a heartbeat. Even if it meant the heartbreak of not winning a championship or getting past the Celtics or whatever, you would still take that in a heartbeat over a lot of what Knicks fans had to endure for various spans of time.
And I think this is one of those times where, and I have not done nearly as good a job of echoing this sentiment over the last few days, but I'll try to make up for it now, which is that things are never as bad as they seem when you are losing, and just like things are never as good as they seem when you are winning. And right now they're down and they're trying to find their way, but we'll see. Maybe we'll look back on that little whatever it was, 35-12 spurt against the Celtics in the third and fourth quarter as the start of something. But that's got to be the hope, right? Howard, before I let you go, what's something fans can look forward to for your work? They find you and all of your great stuff. You mentioned the pod a couple of times, but plug away.
Appreciate it. No, all the written work at theringer.com, of course. The Real Ones podcast, I'm on every Tuesday and sometimes other times with Logan Murdoch and Raja Bell. Also have, and I say this with as gently and respectfully as I can, because I know this is a Knicks fan audience, but the Ringer produced an incredible documentary, 9-part documentary on the Boston Celtics. Yes, I know it's the Celtics. You don't, but as I told Jonathan and Andrew before we started the pod, this is for basketball fans, period. And that documentary, I have nothing to do with the documentary itself, but it's going to be on HBO, but it is a Ringer production. It debuts on March 3rd. And I think it's every week was a new installment. I've been watching some advanced trailer or advanced episodes, because Michael Pina, my colleague at the Ringer, and I are doing a 1-hour discussion of this on the Ringer NBA show podcast feed that will publish later this week. So that's awesome. As long as I'm plugging things, I will plug us talking about the Celtics, and it's the entire expanse of the Celtics, not just obviously the championship years, the dynasty aspects, but everything. Racial strife in Boston, and going back to the very beginnings of the franchise, obviously up through the present. It is very nuanced. It hits high highs and low lows. It's really good. They got some incredible interviews for it, including both Jerry West and Bill Walton, who, of course, we lost both of them last year, and they got them both for the doc. And there's just a lot of really good stuff there. So plug for the documentary that I did not have anything to do with, but plug for the podcast that Pina and I are doing later this week.
I mean, if you're a Knicks fan, I don't know, and you're maybe, like you said, you're a younger Knicks fan, I don't know that you could have an appreciation for the championship teams without having an understanding and appreciation for those Celtics teams, because that was their hurdle. Like this, much like the Celtics appear to be right now for these Knicks, like the Celtics back then, that was the team they needed to get by. I can't wait to watch the doc, and even more so, I can't wait to listen to you and Michael, who obviously is awesome and been a big fan of his for a long time too. Howard, it's always a pleasure. I always am so happy to talk to you because it's always grounded, and it's always funny to think back to when we first spoke, when I was flying off the handle about some nonsense you said about Tim Hardaway Jr. Shout out to Timmy.
Was it really about Tim Hardaway Jr.?
It was about
that's really funny.
Tim Hardaway
Probably
Jr.'s contract versus Danilo Gallinari's contract. That's what it was. I will never forget it.
That's fantastic. I love it.
But I'll tell you this. I'll say this every time you're ever on the pod. Back when I didn't know my ass from my elbow, and when no one knew who I was, or Knicks Film School was still in its infancy, you decided to come on the podcast and shoot the breeze with me, and I was honored then, and I'm honored now because you're as good as they come. Thank you for taking the time, and I look forward to checking out you and all your stuff from here on in during the season.
No, appreciate all that kind of you to say. Always fun to come on. Thanks for having me back. And I'll see you on Court Street or somewhere in the mean streets of Cobble Hill.
Sounds like a plan to me. And everybody out there, thanks for checking out another episode of the Knicks Film School Podcast. And we'll be back with more fun and games before you know it, with me doing the post game after the Sixers game on Wednesday night. Pre-game pod coming from Andrew as well. So yeah, stay tuned for all that, and we'll be back soon.